All right, so here we are. We're going to get into chapter 2, which is going to look into the book of Genesis. Obviously, Genesis means origins. It's the Greek word for the origins in the beginnings. Bereshit is the word in Hebrew, which means beginning as well. And we'll talk more about the word Bereshit next week. But for this week, we're just going to do an overview of the book of Genesis and some important concepts that get into the content and history of the book of Genesis. So, first, we're going to talk about the content and the structure of the book of Genesis. So, generally, most scholars are going to agree that Genesis is just divided into two parts, Genesis 1 through 11 and 12 through 50. And they're going to call 1 through 11 the primordial history, meaning like the history of things before Abraham showed up, for the lack of a better way of saying it, but just the old times. So you've got people living thousands of years, like, Adam and whatnot in Genesis 5. You've got this Tower of Babel where they're trying to reach the heavens. But depending on how you interpret Genesis 6, which will probably be one of the passages I talk about next week, you've got these angels coming down from heaven and having sex with women. So you've got all these sort of primordial, sort of ancient history things happening in there. So that's normally why people are going to say Genesis 1 through 11 is that primordial history. And then they're going to call it the patriarchal history. So after Genesis 11, you narrow in on the patriarchs. And then from there, you're really just hearing the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his descendants from there onward. Now, some scholars might disagree and say maybe it's Genesis 1 through 3, and then 4 through 11, or 6, 4 through 9, because maybe they all think all of that kind of relates to the flood. However, they're going to divide it up, but generally, this is where most scholars are going to fall. And then from there, the patriarchal history is going to be divided into the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, each of them having their own section, and then the story of Joseph. And Joseph kind of dominates the end of the book of Genesis, kind of becoming the most important quote unquote patriarch, though he's never listed in the name. So, God is never known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Instead, it's just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those three become the main, patriarchs. And then Joseph kind of takes up the tail end of that, kind of setting the place where those patriarchs' legacy can kind of live on. And then, God becoming this, not becoming, but God identifying himself in a sense as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from then on throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So one of the things that Dr. Longman wants to emphasize in his book is that there are four main elements that appear in Genesis 1 through 11. And we'll talk about this more in class, and I'm actually giving you an assignment about this after I go through this example. So he's going to say there are four different stories in Genesis 1 through 11, and each of those four stories have this fourfold theme. First, there's sin that's mentioned, and he's going to use the Adam and Eve one as an example. Adam and Eve rebel by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that's element one, sin. And then element two is that God is going to announce a judgment. So God judges the serpent, Eve, and Adam. They're all rebuked in their own way. And then God's going to provide a sign of grace to them. He's going to give clothes to them to cover their nakedness. And then the last thing is God's going to execute that judgment. And Adam and Eve are going to be expelled from the garden and have to live in light of those curses. So those four elements, sin, God announcing judgment, God providing a sign of grace, and God executing judgment. Tremper is going to argue those four themes happen in four different stories throughout Genesis 1 through 11, and that's part of why he's going to say, okay, that's a unit there. All right, so in light of that, your assignment is going to be to do the same fourfold theme on the Cain and Abel story in Genesis 1 to 11. So I will expect you to have this completed by the time we meet. So look for the sin in the Cain and Abel story, the judgment that God announces, how God provides a sign of grace, and then how God executes this judgment in the Cain and Abel story. And then we'll also talk about the other two stories when we meet in person that Tremper thinks that this is in. Now I'm going to attach a video by Tremper Longman into the Populi portal so that you can also watch his comments on how this kind of progresses. It's like a 3 to 5 minute video that you'll watch in addition to my analysis here. And keep in mind, I would disagree with Tremper. Maybe you will as well. He is a mentor of mine. And so you can have good theological disagreements depending on the evidence that you're looking at. There's certain evidence that he's not considering that I would consider when it comes to how I would read the story of Genesis. So that'll be interesting for our conversation as well. All right, so now let's move on to the patriarchal narratives. So Genesis 12 through 50 narrates the lives of 4 patriarchs, God's relentless commitment to his promises. And once again, those patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, though Joseph, the 4th one, doesn't become a part of the triad of the patriarchs here. So first, the promise. God promises Abraham that he's going to be a father of a great nation. But then there is a threat almost initially in the Abraham story that he has no heirs and he has a barren wife. And as far as we can tell, in most cases, a barrenness was associated with God's intentionality on them being barren. That's at least how the biblical authors kind of approached it. So not only is there a barrier here, there's a barrier that seems to have been created by God himself in light of God having given the promise. But then God is the one who ends up fulfilling this because God opens the womb and provides Isaac. So even though there was this sort of barrier, God is the one himself who breaks down this barrier and allows Abraham and Sarah to actually be able to live out the promise that he gave. All right, so when it gets to the authorship of Genesis, there are some issues that we need to talk through. So first off, you can't talk about the author of the book of Genesis without talking about the composition of the Pentateuch. In most cases, people are not going to acknowledge a different author. So either they're going to say, like he's going to point out here, that Moses is the author of Genesis, which means he's the author of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Or they're going to say he's not the author of Genesis, which means he's not the author of any portion of the Pentateuch. That's how people are normally going to do it, in either or, all or nothing. I think we'll have time for me to talk you through my view of the authorship of the book of Genesis in our next lecture. I'll just have to select some things here. But overall, you just want to kind of keep that in mind, that authorship is going to be a tricky issue, and people tend to go to one extreme or another. And the reason why I kind of follow a middle approach here, where I would say Moses is the author of the book of Genesis, in the sense that he is the final composer of the book of Genesis, and he wrote sections of it, but probably not all of it, is because you do have a lot of anachronisms, multiple sources, and editing that is very clearly taken place into the structure and design of the Pentateuch. So even like the one I talked about in the last lecture of the story of Terah coming right after Abraham. So yes, it does flow in the sense that Terah is the father of Abraham. So obviously you should have Terah stories before Abraham's story. But it doesn't flow in the sense that Terah we're told that he dies, but once again, he doesn't die until much later. And then there are intentional links, like I pointed out, between those two. So that's a sort form of Old Testament editing that intentionally wants you to read those stories next to each other in a certain way. So in the same sense, this is important for us to understanding the authorship of the Pentateuch, and the editing helps us to build theology. So we shouldn't be weary of the editing of the Pentateuch. We should embrace it and try to understand what Scripture is trying to teach us by having it being edited in the way that it was. All right, so there's going to be a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to try to parse it out as best I can. And this is a method that you, in a sense, need to memorize. And it has some helpful elements, though it's not one that I follow in its entirety. So pretty much, Julius Wellhausen developed what is known as the documentary hypothesis. And because of this hypothesis, he proposed that the Pentateuch was divided into 4 independent sources that were then all kind of merged together. Now, I will say I do think there is some truth to this view. I follow something very similar called the tablet view, but ultimately this would be the view that he's going to propose. So the first source is going to be called the J source, and that's why the J there is bold. It's for Yahwist source. And he's going to say this source was written in the 10th century, and it's ultimately the parts of the Pentateuch where the name Yahweh or Jehovah is very prominent. So, for example, because Genesis 1 doesn't have Yahweh, but just has Elohim, but Genesis 2 all of a sudden has Yahweh Elohim, he's going to say, okay, Genesis 2 is a part of this J source, but Genesis 1 was not. And the reason is not because of some sort of intentional literary design to switch from Elohim to Yahweh or God to, the divine name. He's going to just say this was somewhat of a sloppy mix up, and these two sources were just kind of blended together. The E source is going to be, and once again, from the south, meaning the southern part of the kingdom of Israel. The E source is going to be this northern source that was written later in about the 9th century. And that this source, once again, is the source that primarily had Elohim. So that's why it's the Elohist source there. So Elohim is a prominent name in this source. Then you're going to have the Deuteronomist source, the D source, and that's related to Josiah's reform in the 7th century. And ultimately, that's where you've got this sort of Deuteronomic influence on the Hebrew Bible. So he's going to say that's, in a sense, when the book of Deuteronomy was written, and then this sort of Deuteronomy theology was kind of overlaid over the Hebrew Bible, which we can talk about more another day, but that's ultimately what the D source is. And then you have the P source, which is everything concerned with the priestly elements. So one of the arguments here, and to be fair, this is one of the stronger arguments for this sort of P source, is that when you look at the stories about Israel, so let's say you look at the story of Judges, you look at the story of the early kings, you don't see the priest actually doing much. They're not actually doing the sacrifices correctly. There's a lot of sort of sloppiness. And the argument that Wellhausen is going to say is the reason that was really sloppy is because it wasn't until the 4th and 5th centuries, after the exile, that these texts were actually written. And then after the exile, moving into Second Temple Judaism, that's when they were actually doing the sacrifices correctly. Well, the reason being is because that's when they actually codified it and wrote down exactly what you needed to do, and then they began to practice it. So there is some strong argument for that, but you could just as easily, in my opinion, argue that it was written earlier and people just didn't follow it. So those are the 4 sources of the documentary hypothesis. Now, the issue here is that people will have taken this and they have modified it in a variety of ways. So some people have JEDPQ or JEDP and a second P, or 2 different versions of D, 2 different versions of E, and no scholar agrees what belongs to J, what belongs to E, what belongs to D, what belongs to P, or any other source that they come up with. So most people today do not follow this, but it is helpful because, like I said, even my view is a modification of the documentary hypothesis, and so it's worth keeping that in mind as you're studying the Pentateuch. And so the means of which they try to distinguish these is based on what theology comes up, what the style of writing, the names that are mentioned into it, the presence of doublets and triplets, and different things like that. But once again, no one agrees on the criteria. So if there was a clear criteria that J has these sort of qualifications, E has these, D and P, then I think that hypothesis would have survived a lot longer. But because there is no real consensus, scholars have in some way, shape, or form abandoned this view of the sources of the Pentateuch. But it's still good to know that, because this influences a lot of commentaries that you may read and a lot of scholars even still today. And so Trimberg gives his kind of own response to this view, and I'll just read through these very quickly. There's not enough focus on the final form of the text and this canonical form of the text. So instead, you're trying to isolate. So some people would go through and say Genesis chapter 2 is from J, and Genesis chapter 4 is from J, and then Genesis chapter 6. And then they would try to put those 3 chapters together and say 6 or 2, 4, and 6 should be read together. And I just picked even numbers just as an example, so that's not fair. But they would just say, take those chapters that belong to J and read those together, and then you'd get to the historical reality of it. But the fact is, they never really got that far, and it really devalued Scripture because it was never focused on the actual final form. And why were these sources put together? If there were 4 different sources, why were they put together, and how do they create meaning and help us understand Scripture? that was never really discussed in this method. And then once again, difficulty in identifying the differences between the sources. Post Mosaic sources and writing appear in the text, but the question is to what extent. So we know that there are some things that came after Moses, but exactly what things and how was never really discussed. And then there was always the question of, are there really 4 independent sources, or do each of these represent separate editorial layers? And no one could really answer that question well, and people were all over the place when it came to that. So either way, this is why a lot of critics don't follow this model. Even if they will say there's some good that comes out of this model, they don't follow it holistically. So there's always going to be the question of, how do you deal with the ancient Near Eastern background of the Pentateuch? And for this introductory course, because I'm much more of a literary scholar and I'm focused much more on the final form of Genesis, and we'll talk about that some, in our next session. I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into this, but if you want to, and there are some interesting parallels and connections and things that you need to understand, is that Enuma Elish, Atherosis, and the Memphite theology all kind of influence Genesis in some way, shape, or form. Exactly how those texts influence Genesis is debated by scholars, and it just depends on kind of the mechanism they're going to use to deal with them. And so, in my dissertation, for example, I worked on how Enuma Elish has some connections even to the book of Esther, and people have kind of noted that in scholarship. But I also pointed out some places where certain evidence was being ignored in light of other evidence. And the same sort of thing, in my opinion, happens when you look at the book of Genesis within the Enuma Elish story. And so at the end of the day, I would argue, similar to Tremper Longman, that the Israelites reject, confirm, and innovate ancient Near Eastern culture and theology and traditions. So even if they borrowed from these traditions, they modified it, they rejected some of the premises, like there were multiple gods, and then they said, okay, this thing might be correct, but then they would change it and modify it in ways that was helpful to the theology that God was actually prompting them to teach. So I would agree with Tremper in the long run there, that there may be some allusions and connections between ancient Eastern literature and the Hebrew Bible, but not such that they followed the same train of thought. And maybe a final way of even saying this, it would be like today with saying, yes, we live in America, and there obviously are ways in which American culture influences how we do Christianity here today. So as a quick example, as far as I know, there are no churches in America who will bring a tithe of corn and grain and all of that to church. They're just going to bring money, and then we'll use that money to maybe buy food and give out food and all of that. But most people are not going to say, hey, I brought the crops from my backyard to pay my tithe. So we use a monetary system that at the moment and so far in our history has worked for us in America. So we also do that in the church because it's working in our culture. Why not make it work in our churches? And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but obviously we want to do that in a redemptive way, right? Like even if people are chasing after money for bad reasons in our culture, we would say, okay, our church wants to gain money so we can have more godly influence. It's not a bad thing for us to want to gain money, just like people outside of church want to gain money, but it's what they want to do with the money. The love of money is the root of all evil, not money in and of itself. So there's all kinds of ways you could look at this, but I think that's the best way to understand it. There are overlaps with the ancient Near Eastern background in the Bible, particularly Genesis, but those overlaps don't mean that Genesis completely follows everything that they have to say. So now let's get into the genre of Genesis. So I would view Genesis as a historical narrative, and Tremper would say it's wanting to come across as historical narrative, but isn't entirely there. And like I said, if you watch his video, we'll have some time to discuss that in person. But we both agree that there is this Toledot formula, which means the generations, that occurs 11 times, and it is used as a structuring device for Genesis. Now, I would argue it goes from Genesis all the way up to Exodus, and that's part of my understanding of how Moses pieced together the story of Genesis. But either way, it occurs 11 times in Genesis, and it's intentional and how it's being used. Those scholars disagree over exactly what it's trying to do. Then you've got the creation and patriarchal narratives that have a theological rather than scientific interest. And so one of the texts for sure I'm going to talk about in the next lecture is Genesis 1. And I'm going to make the case to you that Genesis 1 is not an old earth or a new earth sort of view, or an old earth or a young earth view is what I should have said, sorry. I do think the text of Genesis is neutral. Now, I have my own scientific view based on the scientific evidence that I've looked at, but I'm not a scientist. And I think when you interpret Genesis well, you get this sort of more neutral posture that Moses maybe intentionally took, but definitely by God's providence took a much more neutral posture, because he's just trying to talk about theology. He's trying to get to the goal of what Genesis 1 is about and what it's supposed to teach us about God, more so than to get to the science about exactly how God created everything. He's trying to say why God created everything. It would be how I would nuance that. So at the end of the day, the genre is historical, but motivated by theological means, which is what we call biblical historiography. And as history moves from the general to the particular, so does the content move from theological to the historical realm. And I wouldn't really say it that way as much as I would say all of the historical facts are nuanced with theological meaning. Is probably how I would say that to nuance some of what Tremper is trying to get at here. So we'll end here with his connections section. And some of these you are probably already aware of, and I may bring up some more in the next lecture. But for now, we'll just talk through these. The first one is the seed of the woman. That's very clearly what we call the proto-gospel. The seed of the woman is the one who's going to bring about the reconciliation that we need between humanity and God. And the focus on the seed, it goes throughout Genesis as sin increases as well. So you can see this sort of clear progression. Tremper is going to say it's very clear, at least in Genesis 1 through 11. I would argue it's just clear throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Bible that as humans progress, sin gets worse in the sense of its magnification and its scope. And I would just use one example, to nuance my argument, though I'm not saying I'm completely right here. But for example, Cain had the ability to kill one person, his brother, which is horrible, but he couldn't have necessarily killed 1,000 people. Depending on your view, 1,000 people didn't even exist at that point, but for sure, he couldn't have done that. He didn't have the means to do that. If he tried to fight 1,000 people, someone would have taken him out at some point. But today, one person does have that ability through nuclear bombs and other things like that. And I'm not trying to say nuclear is bad or certain types of guns are bad per se, but people have the means to do more evil today than they did in the past. And you could also argue the other side of that, they have the means to do more good today than maybe they even did in the past. So I do think there is a progression of sinfulness, but at least in the context of Genesis, you could say this is happening for sure in Genesis 1 through 11. So the patriarchal narratives gives a sort of transparent portrayal of the strengths and weaknesses of all of the patriarchs. And that's one of the arguments for how it's very historical, because we don't just get this whitewashed picture of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We get the reality of them. So I just got done, with a study that I'm doing for You Magazine on Isaac and Jacob, and how Isaac had this strong sense of favoritism for Esau, and Rebecca obviously had this favoritism for Jacob, and that Jacob takes on that same element of favoritism. So you get very clear portrayals of them, of their goods and bads. None of them are whitewashed to be holier than thou. They come across as real people and real sinful people. And so these people need redemption, just like the rest of us. And there's a certain sense where you can say, okay, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could be redeemed, and this is part of what I think Hebrews is trying to get at, where he's trying to say we have this crowd of witnesses in Hebrews 11 and 12. So if they can be redeemed, then so can we, because we're no worse than them. Hopefully we're better in some ways. Though I don't want to say that modern people are better than ancient people. I'm saying the goal is that we want to live better. We want to live holier. We want to live like Christ. So we want to be better than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But at the very least, we can know that if God saves them, he's going to save us as well. And then the last point he'd make here, it is not a human initiative, but a divine activity that ultimately accomplishes the redemption and reconciliation of humanity in creation with Yahweh. So once again, throughout Genesis 1 through 11, throughout the text of Genesis, there's no indication that any sort of human initiative is going to save everything. So we can even take really quickly the Joseph story. It's not Joseph that prompts himself to dream and prompts himself to be in the right circumstances, but it's by God's divine hand that Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams, and he's always in the right circumstances that he can bring the reconciliation. So it's always God behind all of this. All right, so you got the connections that point out why we would need a Savior. But now the question is, how does that connect directly to the Savior, to the good news, in response to the fact that we need one? So Trumper's going to argue that Christ is the second Adam who redeems the fallen world through his obedience to reversing the curse of Adam's disobedience. So he's going to point that out in Romans and whatnot. So that knowing that there's an Adam is going to be key to knowing that there needs to be, quote unquote, a second Adam. Second, he's going to say Jesus is the seed that's promised to Abraham, and he's going to point out that Paul says this in Galatians, but I would argue that same argument is in the Old Testament itself. Tremper and I would disagree on that. So he's going to say Paul comes back and kind of retrofits an argument to the Old Testament, versus I'm going to say that argument is embedded in the Old Testament, and Paul is just pointing it out in Galatians. And then from here, he's going to say God reverses the evil intentions of humanity for his own benefit in the lives of both Joseph and Jesus. And I kind of already talked about that one as well. So for Tremper, there are at least these three different ways in which the gospel anticipates, or Genesis anticipates, the good news of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Though he's going to argue it's mostly from a New Testament perspective that we can see that. I would argue you can see that in the Old Testament itself, and the New Testament authors are just pointing that out to their modern audience at the time, which is the same thing we should be doing today to people.